Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I will shortly introduce myself. So I'm from Romania. I've been in the IT industry for about 8 years now, and I'm doing mostly automation for like 5 years or something like that. I do a lot of backend testing, but also front-end, so of course with Selenium. In my spare time, when I get the chance, I will blog about testing or my travels, which I do quite a lot, especially lately, which is a good thing. And I would like to show you a different approach today for something that I came across quite a lot during my past few years, having to test modules that are really complex. So when you would look at the page and you would have something that's like, it has a lot of labels, a lot of text, a lot of images, and so on, what I would normally see in some tests is a lot of assertions, because you need to test all the properties that you see in that module on the page. And you know, the classic approach that I also used a while back was to just assert each of those properties that I was interested in. This was, so I kind of had this issue with the modules that appeared in several areas of the site I was testing, or when I had to test something really, really complex, I would just use a bunch of asserts. Or another kind of testing that I had to do was to test the same module and to see that it looks properly and it has the correct text in several languages, because we have a site that is localized and we have like 15 languages or something like that. So some examples of items that you might use this approach for is if you need to, like, let's say you have some rating modules or some review modules, right? You have a site where somebody shops for something and they would just rate that item. And let's say you would have to test that the rating module displays all the correct stuff, right? So that you have the, I don't know, 5 stars, that you have a comment from the people who reviewed your product, and so on. Or another thing that I'm thinking of is like Google search results. So let's say you go to Google and you want to search for specific items, and you would like your blog to appear in the search results at different positions, you know, like the first ranked item that comes up or the third one, and so on, based on your keywords. And you would like to test that the entry in the Google result is properly displayed, so that it has the correct, you know, like the title that says this is your blog, and then the summary, and then some other links that might appear below that. So this kind of testing was usually done with a lot of assertions, because you wanted to test for the title, for the summary, for all the links there, and for all the attributes that those links had. And this was not effective, because if you do this, you will have a lot of assertions. Sometimes you wouldn't even know if you wanted to change something. You would have to go through all those assertions to identify your element, and it would be really, really tricky to do that. Even if you would do that for your own tests, like a month after you wrote them, it's not very easy to look after. So what you would actually do would be to have one assertion for each property, right? And that is not the best approach. I will show you another way of thinking about your objects, right? About the things that you need to test. You should see everything as objects. So all the modules that you want to test are basically objects. By the way, just a short disclaimer, this talk will be about Java, and I'm also using IntelliJ to help me out with some of the stuff here. So when you will look at your module, let's say you have a link that you want to make sure that appears in several areas of your site. It has to have the same label, so you need to read the same thing when you're looking at the label. It has to take you to the same URL in each place where it appears. And you also want to make sure, for example, that when you click on the link, it will take you to a different tab. It's not going to load in the same tab, right? So when you're going to look at the link, you are going to identify some properties that you need to test. The label, the target, so for opening in the same page or not, and the URL that opens. These can be all mapped into an object, right? So whenever you're going to look at the things that you need to test when you're going to look at your modules, you can identify certain objects. You can think of them like objects. You know, like you have cards that are objects, like I think it's one of the most used example in object-oriented programming. A car, it has some properties, right? Wheels, steering wheel, color, and so on. You can think of the same properties that can apply to your pages and to your modules that you need to test. I'm going to show you some examples just to make sure that everybody's on the same page here. The approach is really, really easy, basically. Getting the hang of it might be a bit trickier at the beginning, but once you see some examples, it's going to be really easy, and you're going to kind of be addicted to this approach. So there are like 2 kinds of ways of identifying your objects. The most common one would be the top-down approach. So you will have to test a huge module, right? It has a lot of things in it. It has images, texts, links, and so on. What you will want to do would be to just break that large module and extract smaller modules out of it. So you will just define the large module, like it would be, let's say, the Google result, right? So it's a big module. And what does it have? It has a title, and the title is also clickable. So the title has certain properties in the background, right? So the title is basically an object because it's a link. It has the URL behind it, it has the label, and so on. What's coming below the title in the search result will be the text. That it's a summary of your page. So that is a string. So that's easy to represent. You don't need a new object for it. It already is there in Java. And so on, you will just break down your module until you get to primitives and strings, for which you don't need to define any other object. The bottom-up approach is to just go the other way around. So you can just start with building small objects out of primitives and strings. So, for example, I'm going to show you exactly the link object. So link is the easiest one, right? In the HTML, you have the tag that identifies your link, which is an A element, right? The A element has properties like the href, which shows which URL to open. If on that element you will use get text from Selenium, you will get the label, and so on. So we are just going to identify the attributes that you have in the A element. And based on that, you can build your link object. And I will show you an example. First of all, what I'm interested in an object. So what's going to help you create your tests? So first of all, you need to have the properties, right? So as I said, the link has the label, the target, and the URL. These are all properties, right? These are attributes. So you can create an object which has these three attributes. Then you will need to generate your constructors. You will need two constructors. One of them to generate your expected content. So in case of a link, you already know the values, which are strings, that you will need to have for that particular object. So you're going to generate a constructor that will take as parameters strings just to generate your expected content. And then you will generate another constructor to which you will pass the identifier of the web element based on which the actual content will be built. Once you pass to that constructor the web element, you can extract its properties, right? So you can identify the attributes of the link based on the web element, because you will extract all the attributes from the page, right? And then in the end, so these are objects. You will need to implement the equals hash code and toString methods to be able to compare to objects, because that's how objects work. And at the end, you will just have one assert that asserts that your expected object equals the actual object. I know it's a bit fuzzy, so let's get to an example, right? So let's say you need to look for this link, right? You have, I'm not sure if you see it in the back, but you have a link that has a label that's read about testing. And if you click on the link, it will take you to my testing blog, and it will open in a new page, right? So you need to test this in several. I want to cross-sell this link, and I will put it in several places. Each of the places where this appears so it's going to have a unique identifier. Let's say I'm going to have an ID for that element. In this case, this link that I'm interested in has an ID of awesome link. So that is how I'm going to identify this link in a particular place where I'm going to test for it. This is like a bigger representation of the link. So I have the ID that I will only use to identify where exactly I'm looking for that specific link. And I'm going to be interested in the href, so that I know that it takes me to my testing blog. I will want to make sure that the link will open in a different page, so I will be interested in the target attribute. And then the label, which is going to be with get text. Okay. So for this, I will map all these properties, like the href, the target, and the label, into an object. I will create a new object, which I'm going to name link, and I will put in the properties, like the link URL, which is going to be a string, because I have a string there. I'm going to put the target, just to identify where the link opens, and the label, which is also going to be a string, right? Okay. Now, I will generate the constructor for the expected content. when I will generate my expected content, I already know the values for each of those properties. So all I will need to do is call the constructor with the values that I already know I'm interested in. The good thing about this is that if you're using IntelliJ, for example, the constructor will be automatically generated by you. If you hit Alt-Insert, you have a drop-down with all sorts of things that it can do for you. So it can build this constructor automatically for you. The other part that you're going to work a bit for is going to be the constructor for the actual content. Because you will need, for the link object, which is the easiest one, you just need to pass in the identifier of the web element. Here you will just need to create a constructor that will have that web element as a parameter. And based on it, you will extract the properties of the web element, and you will add them to the properties of your object. So each of those attributes that you identified before, like the link that will open, the target, and the label, you can extract all of these based on your web element. And if you think about this, so currently, when you define this, it just has to receive a web element as a parameter. You can use this to test all sorts of links. The only thing you will need to provide this constructor will be the web element that represents what you are trying to test. So in this example, I was looking at the read about testing link, right? Maybe I have another link that says read about travels, and I'm interested in this particular link to take me to my travel blog. So I already have a constructor defined that I can use across several tests, and I will only need to provide the ID or the unique identifier of that web element for the content to get automatically generated based on that particular constructor, if it makes sense, right? Okay. So considering that I already have the properties, I have the constructor for creating the expected content, the one for the actual content. The only thing I'm left to do is define, so I put this in the test class, let's say. You can put the expected content in a separate class, just not to pollute your tests. But for the sake of the example, I'm just putting it in the test class, and I'm going to create my expected link, and I'm going to call the constructor, which takes strings as parameters, and I will expect for this link to be as the first parameter, which is the URL. In this case, I will have my testing blog. Then the second thing there is going to be the target, and the third one is going to be the label. So this is what I expect to see on my link. And in my test, this is the only thing that I'm going to do in my test, just one assert, because, well, I kind of omitted the data preparation step, so opening the page, navigating to wherever the link is. But the actual checking part of the test is going to be just one assert. So I'm going to assert the actual element against the expected one. So in this assert, I will first call the link constructor that has the identifier, so the web element, right, as parameter. So here I will generate the actual content. So what happens is that I created a page object class, and there I defined what the web element is, and I will just feed into the constructor the identifier for that web element. So the constructor behind will extract all those attributes, and it will create a new object that has all those properties that it takes from the page, right? And I've already defined the expected link, which is this one. So the only thing this assert will do will compare each of the attributes of the objects. It will look for the URL, the target, and the label, right? So that's all it does. In case they are equal, everything is going to be fine. In case they are not equal, you are going to see an error in the console. So I'm referring to IntelliJ. You're going to see an output in the console that will show that there is a difference between the two. And if you click, there's a link there that says click here to see the differences. If you scroll there, you will see exactly which attribute has a mismatched value, right? You will see where the difference is between all the attributes that you provided to your test. So this is kind of like a soft assert, but it's also a one-line code, right? Which is much, much easier to do. Okay, so this is a very simple example. This is a link object. But what if you need to test for a module? like I defined a reading module here. And what I see here are several things. So the first thing is an image object. I will also show you the HTML code. So the image, for my example, it has a source, so where it's loading the image from, and it has a width and a height property. And I'm interested in testing my module so that this image is rendered with a specific size and that it comes from a specific URL. What I also see here on the page is plain text, which says, go ahead, read something. So that I can interpret as being a string. The image, for me, when I look at it, it's an object, because it has more than just one property, right? It's not just the URL it's coming from. I want to make sure that it renders properly within the module, so then I will look for the width and height properties. Also, just below that, I will have a link, which I already defined, right? So I already know what a link is. I will just use the constructors that I defined earlier, but I will need to write a new object for the reading module. And this is like the top-down approach. So I'm looking at the entire module, and I'm identifying everything that I have there. I know that the image is something more complex than just a string, so I will put an object for it. The second part, the white text, it's just an H2 element, so it's just a text. It's just a string. It doesn't need me to write a new object for that. However, the link is an object, but I already defined that. So what I will do is just create a new reading module object, and I will pass in the parameters that I'm interested in. I'm going to say private image, because the first thing, as I said, is an image. It's an object. I will define the image object later, but for once, I just know that I need an image object, right? And I will represent it afterwards. I know that the second attribute will be a string, and the third one is a link, okay? I will create the two constructors. So this is the one for creating the expected content. And I already know that I need to pass in an image, a string, and a link, right? So the image will be an object, which I will pass in. I'm not going to show you the image example because it's similar with the link one. It's just, it has 3 different attributes. So I will pass in an image that I already know that I expect to be there. I will pass in the string that I'm interested in and the link that I want to appear there. And in this case, I've already defined the expected link, so I will just feed in the one that I defined a bit earlier, the expected one. Okay. In this case, I have the actual content. Now, the actual, depending on how large your module is, you might need to provide not just one web element. Maybe it will be more than one, depending on what is the module that you need to test, right? So you need to extract all of those properties based on one or several web elements. In this case, I just put one because I kind of found the relative elements that I'm interested in to the web element that's like the top module element, if that makes sense. So I'm just I'm extracting all the properties that I'm interested in order to generate everything. The image will be generated based on its own web element. And from that web image, which is, in this case, this thing is in gray, right? So for this object, I will just extract the source, the width, and the height properties. Okay? After I defined these constructors, I'm ready to call them from my tests. So this is going to be a bit heavier, but so I already wrote the expected link. I know what it is. Let's say that the image is a new image that has some URL and the specified width and height. And based on this, the expected reading module is just going to be a new reading module that has as properties the expected image, which I defined here, the text, which I just put in plainly because I know already what it is, and the expected testing link, which is the one up here. I know it might be a bit confusing, but I'm sure you will have access to the slides, so you can just take a look and try this approach at home with whatever you want to see. I mean, you can just take you can just start with the basic, just the links. So once you get the hang of doing the links, it's going to be so much easier to build on top of that, right? Okay. So once you have defined your expected module here, so this is a reading module, you can just again, you will process the data, you will get to the page where the module is, and you will just use one assert, the reading module, which is the expected one versus your actual one. And in this case, again, each of the properties will be compared separately by the assert, because they are two objects. But this is a bit, let's say it's going to be a bit recursive, because you will compare, first of all, you will compare the two images, which are objects. So all of the image properties will also be compared against each other. The thing is, when you're going to build larger and larger modules, you will have a lot of properties that will be asserted against each other. So when you will have a test failure, depending on the size of your modules, you might have a lot of values that don't match. So you'll need to be very careful to inspect the whole output when you will see an error there. Okay? And it's very, very important to name your stuff properly, because if you're just going to have a label like everywhere, you won't really know whether it's the label from the link or the label from the image or from any other object. So naming is very, very important. Okay. This is what it looks like. So this is just the console output from IntelliJ. So if you can see here that this is a test that fails, right? So in this case, my expected and actual URLs were not the same, because this one, the expected one, has HTTPS, and the actual one was only HTTP, right? So this is a very, very simple console output. Usually, you would look at that view, as I said, with the two screens in parallel. Well, you will just drag from one side to the other to see all of the properties, or you can just do your own special output, just to make it clearer, to provide all the data that is easier to read, maybe. This is just the default that I'm using from IntelliJ. So as a little bit of a diagram here, what I did here was like a summary of what I did, right? So I created a page, right? I created a page where I defined my web element. This is the reading module web element. This is the one that I will provide to construct my reading module. I have created three objects here. So I created the link one, which has those three properties that I mentioned. I created the image one. And I created a reading module, which takes as attributes an image, so one of these things, and a link. And then a string, which is not a separately defined object. So in my test, the only thing this is a test where I also did some link assertions. But when it comes to the reading module, I created a reading module, the expected one based on strings and other objects. And the actual one was just reading the properties from the page. So this is the approach. What you will do is create expected content, because you already know what you need to have there. Strings, primitives, other objects. Create your actual based on the page that you're going to inspect. Getting the data from the page is seamless in your tests. You don't have to process anything within the test. You will process all the data within the constructor. So you will just need to pass in the correct web element or web elements, and just let the constructors do the magic for you in the background. Okay? So your test will be just a one-liner in this case. If you want to have larger modules, yeah, you're still going to have one line, but the object will be a bit more complicated. So it really makes sense to analyze beforehand exactly what kind of modules you need to test for. Maybe you're not going to do everything in just one object. Maybe it makes sense to break them down. For example, if you have a page, right, which is, let's say you have let's say it's a shopping cart, right? You have several areas in your shopping cart. You will have the product that you're going to buy. You will have payment data, for example. You will have similar products, right? So this is a big object that has like several objects. You don't necessarily have to module everything in just one huge object. You can test individually for those categories of products, right? So you'll test separately the similar products. You will test separately the payment area, and you can test separately whatever you have in your cart currently. So it all just comes down to looking at the page and analyzing it and seeing what makes more sense from a test perspective. You don't want to have tests that you won't be able to read. So you want an approach that makes your tests short, but also very easy to read and easy to maintain, right? So don't go overboard. Don't just create modules or objects for everything, just where it makes sense. it really wouldn't make sense to create or to use this approach if you just need to do like 2 asserts, maybe. But once you get to a large number of that, you should definitely think about this approach because it's a bit better and it looks nicer. And it makes you, think more object-oriented, right? And it also helps, I think it helps a bit the developers to look at your tests because they will definitely understand this kind of structure. And if they're going to look at like a million asserts, they're just going to curse and not be very happy about it. So, yeah. OK, so as a summary, I see we still have time. So instead of writing a bunch of assertions, just do object analysis. Identify and module your objects on the page instead of just writing the asserts. And then just compare the expected object with the actual object. It's really easy. As I said, I suggest you just try with something simple. And afterwards, after a while, you will just see that this approach comes naturally. Whenever you will see like larger modules, you will think, yeah, this is an object. I can definitely do it properly, right? Like in a shorter manner. And as with every approach, there are pros and cons, right? So the pro, of course, is that you're going to have much cleaner tests. What I really, really hate about tests is seeing a lot of non-checking related data there. So I don't want to see a lot of data preparation, all the data providers, and so on. I like to see more the checking parts. So I usually would put things that are not check-related in a separate class or in separate modules or whatever. So the test should be really clean. So when you're looking at the test, you want to see the actual checking part. Okay? Also, a very good thing about this approach is that once you create an object, so like you're creating the link object, you can create as many links as you want. You only have to create that constructor once, right, and use it in several places, right? Also, once you define a particular object, you can reuse it across your test. So if you would have, let's say, maybe a footer that you need to test across, I don't know, several products, once you define your expected, you don't need to define it again. So this is a very helpful approach for that. Of course, there are cons. So one of the cons is that in case you have such large modules, it's going to be tricky to read the assertion failure. And especially, it's going to be very tricky if you don't follow the naming conventions, as I mentioned. So try to use best approaches, especially when you're working with Java, like naming and putting your code in the correct places and so on, structuring it very, very well. It will help you a lot, honestly, afterwards. OK, so that was about it from me. If you would like to talk more about this, I'm available on Twitter and so on. And I also, I think we will have these slides available in the presentation, so feel free to get in touch. I know it's a bit trickier at the beginning, but you will love it if you just try it out. OK? So thank you.